So, how do we know this Jesus existed? Well, in order to understand this question, we need to understand two things. His records develop a bit later, and his existence happens to be recorded. It's there, we just don't accept it. Or at least some people don't, or a lot of people. But in this video, I will cover three things: the evidence, the authority of the evidence, and the denial of the evidence due to the person's faith in their evidence. Which sounds a bit odd, but I'll explain when I get there. So, in the evidence, we need to understand the psychological standpoint behind his existence. People that followed him did leave him because they were confused on what he was talking about. So we know that there was no devoutness in his lifetime, but his death began Christianity, which if you watched The Case for Christ, you know that that one reporter said that if you can debunk the death of Jesus, then Christianity is a house of cards. So we need to understand that that is our basis, but knowing this, we need to find out how did his death start Christianity and why would it matter? Jesus was denied and many times in the New Testament, and when he died, no one believed him anymore because everyone lost faith in who he said he was, because no one expected the prophecy to be like this, which is why the Gospels have some explanations for what Jesus was saying, because even they didn't understand what he was saying. So when he died, the only thing that they understood was that he died. Did you catch that? Even after you read verses like Matthew 26:28, stating that his blood would be shed as the covenant for all of humanity and save the house of Israel as promised all the way back in Genesis, they still didn't understand it. But they became Christians once Jesus rose because the sign of Jonah had been prophesied and the seed of a woman bruising Satan's head all made sense at that point. So in understanding if he existed, we must understand his causes effects, not cause and effect. Because when he told the disciples to preach the gospel in Mark 16:25, it caused this huge burst of Christianity that can be seen in history. And the place where it began is insanely important, because if no one knew who Jesus was, then how would they have converted them that quick? The Pharisees of Jerusalem knew very well on who Jesus was, and even the people of Jerusalem knew who he was. But the people thought nothing of it other than that he was dead. But what Peter did was very important, because we can affirm that Jesus existed, because if he didn't, then the people would have never converted and stoned him right there on the spot. No questions. No false prophets. Plus, this was during Pentecost. So many devout Jewish people came to Jerusalem. But 3,000 would have never converted unless they never were informed that his resurrection was true and that he was the Messiah, as explained by witnesses that were mentioned in 1 Corinthians 15:6. And only by that, it would only account for the conversions. Because my reasoning for this is that the Jews follow this ideology of 2 or 3 witnesses making something true. So if we follow a bit of some calculations, we know that 3,000 divided by 500 equals 6 people per witness. And this is probably big news, but they held no commandment to preach yet. So logically, it would probably end up being half. So from 1 to 3 people being spoken to, or all of them, if they told them beforehand, but which is basically what I'm trying to go at. But because the only way a Jewish person would eat pork is if they believed something enough to do it. And these were devout, religious people. So they had to have believed something enough to do it so much that later they would be persecuted over it. Which they did get persecuted. I mean, you can see evidence of that in Nero's time as Caesar. So in this psychological analysis, we can conclude that Jesus was well known enough to convert people. But how can we trust that the verses I've quoted are true? Well, let's start at 1 Corinthians. That source can be trusted well, and that branches to the other Gospels. But first, let's explain why it's trusted. There's a writing by the Bishop of Rome, Clement, that actually talks about Paul and Peter's persecution during Nero and Paul's letter to the Corinthians, so we can trust the first letter. But a lot of people tend to distrust the others, but we'll talk about that maybe. Which, by the way, The writing this is found in is called the Epistle of Clement or First Clement. But this is important because First Corinthians states that there are other writings. I mean, if you read First Corinthians 15:4, where it talks about scriptures that have Jesus being stated as being buried and then rising from the dead. Because obviously the Old Testament did have something like that. They didn't have even Jesus in it, but they knew the idea of the Messiah. So he connected them in 1 Corinthians 15:3. And also, 1 Timothy confirms this when Paul quotes straight from Luke in 5:18. The laborer is worthy of his reward. And since Paul died around 67 AD, we can confirm that there is a gospel that is close to Jesus' death. Although we can't affirm why the Gospels came late, because they were preaching as much as they can to convert people and really hoping that the rapture would happen right there. And you have to remember that a lot of these guys were pretty much getting old at that time, and they had to have written their letters or scrolls of the Gospels right before they died. Like John, he had to have written it while he was exiled. It would make sense, but getting through to people isn't as easy as when Peter did it, or all the other disciples did it. So I would like to discuss that third section I had in mind. When we hear something, we always use our knowledge to perceive it and check whether or not it's trustworthy, which is why it's hard to convert an atheist who grew up with an atheist father, or a Muslim who lives in Saudi Arabia. Most likely, non-Christians will try to debunk Jesus' existence and basically everything a Christian will say. Or at least that's from my experience trying to convert people. But the thing is that even historians know he did exist at some point because of his death. I mean, with the details. Like, he brought up a kingdom that was not of this earth and that it had an army that he controlled. So it would make sense that Rome would be fine with crucifying him for even a political crime. But even Pontius didn't see anything wrong with him. But historians see it that way, but really, when you read the Bible, if you believe this, then you know that Pontius gave Jesus to the Jews to do whatever they want with him. But the thing about his death is that it's one of the most trusted events, but denying it means that you deny it over your perception, not on the evidence. Which is why I really hope that if an atheist or a Muslim sees these videos, I hope that they open their mind a bit more. This is the first video where I actually got to hit some points I really wanted to get to, but I would like your input. I hope the video came out well, but that's all I can really explain and reason for why Jesus would have existed. So, I guess this is the end of the video. So God bless you all. Hope to see you in the next video.